76, hiding in the Carolina swamps by day and surprising them with swift strikes at night. They called me a tricky swamp fox, so a swamp fox I became. Swamp fox, tail on his back. Nobody knows where swamp fox is. Swamp fox, I'm in the glen. He runs away to fight again. Like wild guns of birds they wing, their startled cries a signal clear. Women march forth to fight the king, and leave behind their loved ones dead. Swamp fox, tail on his back. Nobody knows where swamp fox is. Swamp fox, I'm in the glen. He runs away to fight again. Always fought with an empty gun, only made a shout of louder. We are men, the very young. We had no cornhole, had no money. All we had was guns and money. Like that's the worst thing in a while. Roses years upon them was all we ever got. Swamp fox, tail on his back. Nobody knows where swamp fox is. Swamp fox, I'm in the red. He runs away to fight again. We had no blankets, had no beds, had no roof from our heads. We got no shelter when it rains. All we got is empty brains. The red folks fight in a far-off land. Their hearts are far across the sea. They never try to understand. We fight for home and liberty. Swamp fox, stay on his back. Nobody knows where swamp fox is. Swamp fox, I'm in the glen. He runs away to fight again. Swamp fox, stay on his back. Nobody knows where swamp fox is. Swamp fox, I'm in the glen. He runs away to fight again.
He's past president of Spartanburg Methodist College, and he's also a recipient of the Order of the Palmetto. So I think you're the first person I've met who's actually a recipient of the Order of the Palmetto from our governor, and that's certainly a high honor here in this state. And we are thrilled to have you with us today, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Good, thank you.
Get these electronics worked out. I'm going to try to go without the speaker. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, let's see if that'll work. Oh, this something wrong. I'm very delighted to be here. If you'll take an old soldier on half pay, one with the walking wounded, I'm delighted to be here. You have to take me in the impairments with which I have today. They tell me there's some honor in being 72 years of age and having a football injury. But I find that right now, after having this for 5 weeks and having 3 more weeks of wearing these casts, to see any honor in it. The only thing about it is that I now know what I'll be when I grow up. I'm going to be a decrepit, broken old man. The adrenaline gets to flowing when you're playing with the grandchildren. It leads you to do some very, very odd things, like touch well, I shouldn't say touch. It was more than a touch, the football that day. But I'm delighted to be here. It's a great day to spend time with people who are interested in the Revolutionary War history and heritage. When I retired approximately 7 years ago from what I thought had been a very active and varied career, both with the Army and with the United Methodist Church. Basically, I'm a Methodist clergy in background. I retired from the Methodist Church 7 years ago, both as a pastor, college president, college teacher, and Army chaplain. I started looking around for something to do with the rest of my life. I have a remarkably good health, and after 90 days, my wife told me that I got out of the house for the daytime when she was getting out of the house. We were sharing her sewing room together as a study in a sewing room, and for me and too much presence with each other. So I started to pulling out my old notes of a 50-year hobby of Revolutionary War history. Mainly, my interest was military history and battlefields. And then I started looking at my notes. I said, goodness, this is a remarkable heritage as it started coming together with notes about sites I'd visited all over South Carolina. And I started going back to visit those sites, and amazingly, I found that we were losing them. And when I visited the Musgrove Mill site in Lower Spartanburg Union and Cherokee County, Lawrence County, split between 3 counties, I found that all the land on the west side of Highway 56 at the Enoree River had been bulldozed, just cleared off by a bulldozer, and it had part of the Musgrove Mill battlefield. At that point, I decided if you could lose the Musgrove Mill battlefield in a remote part of South Carolina, you could lose any of them. And I began to work across the state trying to build leadership with people who were sensitive to this, and let's try to preserve as many of these sites as we could. So you understand some of where I come from. I am not a professional historian. In fact, the only history that I've had other than church history that I was required to take is military history. One good thing about the military system, it doesn't matter if you're a chaplain or what branch. When you get beyond your own branch education, you have to take the same education as all the other officers. So the Army forced me to, in order to be promoted, I had to proceed all the way through the Air War College. Now you wonder why a soldier would go to the Air War College, but every so often we cross services for air education, and I was allowed to go to take the War College of the Air Force instead of the Army War. So it was in that system that I got most of my historical perspective. So you understand, I come from a unique perspective. I'd like to do 2 things, and I want to break it in 2 parts. Since I'm told I have almost an hour, and in my training background, you learn at theology school, no souls are saved after 20 minutes. And so I'm trying to break it in two parts and have questions, and we will do it like this. First, I'd like to deal with the role of South Carolina generally in the American Revolution, which is a great heritage that's largely overlooked by the nation and the people of South Carolina, which is a great tragedy. In my mind, that's a great tragedy. Secondly, I'd like to look at 4 conditions, I think, that made Francis Marion the leader that he was. And those 4 conditions, we've got to look at the topography of the land east of the Santee, Wateree dividing line through South Carolina, where Marion was a leader. We've got to look at the demography. We've got to look at the kind of people. What was the resource Marion had to work with? Thirdly, we've got to look at what was British strategy. What was the strategy of the Southern Campaign? Now, we talk about the Southern Campaign as if that was an American strategy. It was not. It was a strategy sent by leadership in London to the British leadership in America. And Marion didn't have to win. Greene didn't have to win. They only had to make sure the British didn't win. They had to defeat the British strategy. We need to look at that. What were the objectives? And thirdly, we need to look at the man. What were the critical ingredients in Marion that made him galvanize the response in this eastern section of South Carolina that contributed, in my mind, probably more than any other section in the country to the winning of the American Revolution. So we'll deal with that and see if we have some questions. Then if there's any time left, I want to look at the stages of the revolution in which Marion operated. The Revolutionary War lasted 8 years. The longest war this country has ever fought was the American Revolution. Now, we kind of lose sense of that perspective. John Adams said in 1776, he said, when the war started, the revolution was over. Because the revolution was really in the institutions, in the minds and the values of people that galvanized, and that was just the first stage of the war. And there were various stages for the next 7 years, of which Marion was a critical leader. And to see the role of his leadership changing, I'd like for us at the end to be able to deal with just a little. Of course, I'm a native South Carolinian. You would expect me to be partial toward the heritage of my own state. But I am convinced that the historical record proves that no state ventured more, no state suffered more, and no state contributed more than South Carolina contributed to the independence of this nation. And I'd be glad to debate this, and pardon to you folks in Pennsylvania, I'd be glad to debate that in Philadelphia. I'd be glad to debate that in Boston. Now, all regions of the country contributed, but my goodness, South Carolina has 250 battle and skirmish sites documented in records of being in South Carolina. Now, this doesn't include raids. If you included raids, it'd be in the thousands. A skirmish and a battle site is an operation by a tactical unit with a mission when they attacked it, not just a raid. South Carolina has at least 250 documented sites. Some say this is more than all the other colonies combined. I don't think so. I think it's probably more than any other 5 or 6 states combined. It's a tremendous record. Another thing, I'm glad we're going to have a presentation on Henry Lawrence. South Carolina was active from the very beginning in the political national institutional building that created this nation. Henry Lawrence, a tremendous leader, a leader of the Congress, the only American ever put in the Tower of London, enough national and worldwide prestige, he was actually swapped for Cornwallis, which shows how the leadership of South Carolina. If you want to look at the money, South Carolina ended up the war on a per capita basis with 2.5 times the debt of any other state in the Union. If you want to look at leadership, look at battles, if you want to look at the money, follow it any way you want to follow, I think you come to a bottom line. No state ventured more, no state suffered more, and no state contributed more than South Carolina. But South Carolina is a large, varied state. And what happened in eastern South Carolina is not the same thing that happened in western South Carolina. So you've got to break South Carolina down into sections to really understand how one section contributed uniquely and how its leadership marshaled that particular part of a very, very varied state. Eastern South Carolina was settled 20 years before western South Carolina was settled by European settlers. Western South Carolina was the end of South Carolina, the end of the emerging United States coast. West of South Carolina was another nation, the Cherokee Nation. Eastern South Carolina is unique, so today I'd like to spend my time looking at the area of South Carolina east of the Santee River and the Wateree River and the Catawba River. Same river, just has 3 names as you move through South Carolina. And I'd like to use a text. Preachers are trained to use text to do what they want to do. But I'm not going to take my text from the Scripture. I'm going to take my text from the song, the words, the lyrics, from the music the British band played at Yorktown at the surrender. They played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Now we know that, but have you ever heard the words? were the words, the European words to that particular piece of music the band played. It goes like this. If ponies rode men, if grass ate cows, you know, you get the point, you know, the whole infrastructure turned upside down. If cats should be chased in holes by the mouse, if summer were spring and the other way around, then all the world would be turned upside down. Well, I think in reality that's what we saw in eastern South Carolina emerge when Francis Marion put together an institution and a force that could not only protect the eastern part of South Carolina, but could contribute toward sending Cornwallis to Yorktown. And that campaign started in this part of South Carolina. Cornwallis never would have been defeated at Yorktown if it had not been for what happened in this region. As General Greene later wrote about it, he said, "I shook the bushes and Washington caught the bird." And it was the shaking of the bushes and what happened here that set up the Yorktown campaign. But let's look at this concept of what happened here that turned the world of a European army. The greatest military force in all the world at that time was Great Britain. And we low rate what happened here when we low rate the power and the effectiveness of the British Army. Didn't matter whether it was on the Camden battlefield, didn't matter whether it was at Hobscurk Hill or Eutaw Spring. If you met the British Army on the field in that war in this country, you almost were going to have either a retreat, and we know it, all of them were either defeat or retreat because of the power of that army. But yet a man like Marion was able to pull together in a world turned upside down of getting those forces in this region that he could pull together. First, let's look at the region. The Santee River is a tremendous barrier in South Carolina. It is a natural barrier that insulates this section from its greatest city, which was Charleston. The fact that the Santee River has a sandbar at the mouth of it, it doesn't flow into Charleston, flows into the Atlantic Ocean between Georgetown and Charleston. The British Navy in its power could not exert itself on the Santee River. And not only was the Santee waterway to Talbot a tremendous barrier, which meant a military commander could plant in this part of the state and insulate himself from the other part. Think of the network of streams in Black River, Lynch's River, Jeffers Creek, Little PD, all of that flows into the two major rivers, which meant the two major road systems of this area had to cross all these rivers. And every road crossing at every stream was a choke point. If you study the terrain of this area of South Carolina, you understand a great deal why not only was Marion a swamp fox, Marion learned how to use the entire region and the terrain. In military terms now, we call that terrain analysis. But Marion was brilliant in his leadership of using the topography. The second thing, the British never understood the strongest force against them was South Carolina sicknesses that grew out of the swamps. Marion had lived here all of his life. His people had lived here. Of course, Marion lived in the lower part of the Santee, which meant his family had been here longer, but in this region, the families had been here probably 15 or 20 years. But they had learned to deal with disease. The British had not. If you look at the green records, and especially look at the letters of Cornwallis, Cornwallis talked more about the illness of his soldiers than he talked about the military terms. He was constantly talking about the hospitals he had to protect because of the illness of his soldiers. The Battle of Camden was really set up when Cornwallis decided he had to defend Camden because he had a hospital there with 800 of his army sick. So it's part of that topography. It's not only the terrain, it's the illnesses and the lifestyle that had to be geared toward living in this particular region of South Carolina. And that's a part of in Cornwallis's world, what it meant, the world turned upside down. Well, let me talk a little bit about the other part of this, which is demography, the study of the population and the people. Amazingly enough, there's very little records of this that I can find that's really accurate. The first census taken was 1790, so you really don't know. Just generally, you have a great deal of knowledge about it, but we know very, very, very little about the particulars. We know this particular region was settled by basically Scotch-Irish that did not come from Charleston. They came down the wagon road whose family heritage went back to Pennsylvania. That's why in South Carolina we have a Lancaster, a Chester, and a York, not because of English names, Pennsylvania names. We know the principal institutions were the Presbyterian Church among the Scotch-Irish and the Baptist Church among the Welsh Baptists. And we get some sense of the common life of a few journals. I came across a roster, though, a study of the roster of Colonel William Thompson's regiment, formed in 1775. The film we saw last night said South Carolina formed 2 regiments in 1775 that became regular troops. No, there were 3. There were 2 regiments of infantry and 1 regiment of dragoons. The dragoons were the backcountry people, and Colonel William Thompson commanded the Rangers. And of course, he came from across the Santee River in Orangeburg County, and his troops were raised from the backcountry. In that roster, when it was formed, they required everybody to tell where their birthplace was. And it's an interesting look at the nature of the human who made up this army. Out of 289, only 52 were born in South Carolina. Only about 20% were actually born in South Carolina. 42%, or 121 of them, were born in Virginia, not South Carolina, which indicates they had migrated to South Carolina. Their family heritage was in Virginia. 33 were born in Ireland. Almost as many were born in Ireland as were born in South Carolina. 28 were born in North Carolina. 22 were born in Pennsylvania. You folks here, you see that great tie between your state and our state. 16 were born in Maryland. 8 were born in England. 5 were born in Scotland. 1 in New England. 1 in New York. 1 in Delaware. 1 in New Jersey. 67 of these were 20 years of age or younger. So it gives you some kind of idea of the nature of the people in this region. What they found here was good soil, and they created in 20 years of time what I think was a strong economy based on the plantation system. Now, today's standards, we would think it as being primitive because most things were done locally. They didn't have much money, but they had tremendous skills and had great soil, and in 20 years of time they built a powerful economy and a good infrastructure, which meant when Charleston fell, this area didn't collapse because it could pretty well take care of itself by the infrastructure of the economy based on the plantation system. The other thing that we need to take note of as we understand Marion, we need to understand that there was a tremendous road system in existence that connected this region with the rest of the country. Two of the major highways for the Northeast came either through Clarendon County or Williamsburg County next to it. One was the extension of the Great Wagon Road from Camden, to Charleston, and that was the major road that Marion fought so many of his battles because it was so critical to the British to keep it open. The other great road from Charleston that went up the coastal area to New York crossed the PD River within 2 miles of Snows Island. So, we think of Marion as going to Snows Island because it was a remote place. We think of him as, he went there because it was swampy and he could hide. That was one good reason. It is remote. We worked with the owner of that land, and we preserved by easement 100 acres of the island where it's the high ground, and we hope that's where Marion's major headquarters was, although research is still a little unclear. It is remote, I tell you. In the natural barrier of the PD and Lynch's River, 2 miles was like traveling from one world to another. But Marion selected that spot not only because it was remote, but because he had access to one of the major roads of his region. So to understand Marion, you've got to understand the terrain, you've got to understand the nature of the society and the culture in which he operated. Another fact probably was the militia was better trained in the backcountry than on the other side of the Santee because of the Indian threat. Across the Santee River, the militia system had become a social society for drinking and carousing and getting away from home, and it become a social party club. In the backcountry, due to the threat of Indians, the militia was far better trained. So when Marion took over a militia system in this area, from the Santee River on up through Camden and Cheraw to the state line, he took over a militia system that was a little better trained. Well, let me move on. I just want to make the point. You don't understand America if you don't understand the social and the cultural and the economic structure out of which he molded a very, very powerful military force in a world turned upside down, where British gold, and British bayonet, and British supply didn't rule. There was something working here other than the power of the bayonet. There was something working here other than a full belly. There was something working here other than the orders sent from London through its command structure to the colonies. And Marion learned how to pick up what was essential in that world turned upside down. And so the mouse could chase the cat. And summer could be spring, because it was a world turned upside down, but the underside of that world had resource that Marion used. The other thing I'd like to move on and talk about a little bit is the British Southern strategy. As I understand it, the British Southern strategy had 2 overall goals. And of course, the Southern strategy did not come from Clinton and Cornwallis. It actually was formulated in London, and they were supposed to implement it. Had 2 main goals, which was to move the British power base from New York and Philadelphia to South Carolina and conquer South Carolina. Of course, we know they started in Savannah, 1779, and but the attack on Georgia was to get the flank secure, so when they came into South Carolina was the strongest state in the South. Charleston was the largest city south of Philadelphia. The South Carolina economy and the wealth of the low country made it per capita wise the richest state in the Union. But essential to the British, Charleston helped control the sugar trade in the Caribbean. The sugar trade was worth more to Great Britain in their inflated economy that was based on sugar. Now, they controlled sugar prices, but actually so much of the wealth of Great Britain was based on the sugar trade. The sugar trade was worth more to Great Britain than the entire gross national product of all 13 colonies. So what do you think they'd protect first? They'd protect the sugar trade in the Caribbean before they would protect their power in the colonies. And Charleston was essential for that. It was in that trade triangle. So their strategy was to take South Carolina and then move, capture North Carolina, then Virginia, and capture Washington from the south. Washington was in forts on the Hudson. The British felt they were not strong enough to attack him. Washington was not strong enough to take New York. There was an impasse in the north. And the last great battle fought in the north, I believe, was a battle of Monmouth Courthouse. No battles were fought in the north in the last 5 years of the war. As they moved south, the Southern strategy campaign, take South Carolina, then take North Carolina, then take Virginia, and after then it was moving up into the north to attack Washington from the south. They started off with a bang. When Charleston fell in May of 1780, the worst defeat of the entire war. We lost an army of, I think, over 6,000 bottled up in siege in Charleston. The entire Southern Army was captured in Charleston. Washington sent Gates south to marshal the remnants of the forces marching south to reinforce Lincoln at Charleston. And of course, Gates, an ego person, not a bad person, just his ego did not make him a good leader for that time in history. He rolled the dice at the wrong time. And the Battle of Camden destroyed on August 16th, only 2 months after Charleston, the second worst defeat of the American Revolution took place at the Battle of Camden, which meant Clinton and Cornwallis thought South Carolina was subjected. They had reached their first military objective. But look at their second objective of the British strategy. The second objective was to marshal the loyalist forces in South Carolina, which were those who had remained loyal to the king, either by their financial interest or there were a lot of sincere South Carolinians that felt that their place was in the British Empire, not as a free nation. You have to respect those people. That was an honest position. And the second part of the Southern strategy was to marshal, organize the loyalists in South Carolina, turn South Carolina over to them to run and to protect the southern base, while Cornwallis was left to march the British Army into North Carolina and then Virginia. And probably Marion's greatest contribution was the British never could have reached their second objective. They were able to take South Carolina wherever they marched with their army. I think they won every battle, but they never won the second one. These active forces never allowed the loyalist system to take over South Carolina. And no place in South Carolina proves that better than this area. The eastern part of South Carolina was the most patriot portion of South Carolina. Those Welsh Baptists and those Scotch-Irish had felt so much and the French Huguenots on the lower Santee had felt so much European oppression, both politically and religiously. They were pretty clear on where their future was. I don't think they understood at that time how a free nation would operate But they understood they wanted a new kind of country. And it was a Marion in the eastern part of South Carolina that did more to bottle up and choke off British power by making the back of the British Army very insecure, because it remained pretty much patriot, and the Loyalists never could organize a system in this part of South Carolina. And the last, and let me quickly, because you probably know more about this, and like the film showed, it was a Marion that emerged into this environment and in June, late May or June, and July and August of 1780, after the fall of Charleston, as a leader. And from that summer of 1780 to the war being over in 1783, Francis Marion was one of the critical leaders in the American Revolution. You saw him emerge as a lieutenant colonel, Continental, who had a foot injury and was away from Charleston on sick leave when Charleston fell. Therefore, he was not in the capture of Charleston. And the British tried to capture him at his home, but he moved quickly to safety and began to work. You see him emerge from being a partisan leader in the beginning. In the end, he was a full military commander, dealing with all the threads of politics, resource, and military concerns. And it was the nature of the man, quiet, private kind of man, not a dashing man, not a warrior, just a real bright, private kind of person who knew when to hold them and when to fold them, and was able to deal with tense crises both on the battlefield as well as the politics. And he was able to pull this together. Okay, I'm going to stop at this point and see if we have some questions we'd like to deal with some parts of this. George, tell me how long we've got.
Just about right to the minute.
Oh, we're not finished?
You did a great job.
Okay. I'm sorry, I thought we went to 9:15. I apologize.
Well, they want to take a break.
Oh, okay.
George, you want to take this away?
Oh, thank you.
It's got the swamp fox on the back for you.
Good.
Dr. Stukes is a native of Manning, and more importantly, I consider him a close personal friend. I have had the opportunity to work at the Bank of Clarendon for the last 17 years here in Manning, and until recently, Dr. Stukes served on our board of directors, and I had the great privilege of eating lunch with Dr. Stukes every Tuesday, and got to know him well, and certainly admire him for his knowledge as well as just who he is. I think a lot of Dr. Stukes. So, Dr. Stukes, please come forward.
That doctor does mean I've been a college professor. So does this necktie. But please, don't let either one of those fool you. I was here last year. Came back this year, and I had been told on several occasions maybe I'll do better this time than I did last time. So this time we're going to talk about, not Francis Marion, not a soldier in South Carolina during the Revolution, in the sense that he bore arms and rode through the woods and the swamps, but a man who was a leader in other ways. Listen up about him. His name is Henry Lawrence, and he's born in 1724, born in Charleston. His family came originally from France, some of the Huguenots who had come across. His father was a worker in leather, a saddler. He's not of the noblemen of South Carolina. He is not of the gentry. He works with his hands. And he did so there in Charleston. He got commissions from people who had the fine horses and carriages. He made a reputation for himself. His business expanded. He did very, very well. Henry was one of his two sons. But John Lawrence, the father, thought that a boy should be about business, not about law, not about theology, but about business. And so, when his son, Henry, was 20 years old, he sent Henry to England to make a connection with an agent there in England whom he knew, a man named James Crockett, and maybe even become, if fortune would have it, a partner with James Crockett. Maybe help to sell some leather goods in England. Henry did go to England. Still, not a young boy anymore. He's 20 years old. In those days, that's mature. And he was there with James Crockett. He made a good impression on James Crockett. James Crockett offered him a partnership in an international trading company. And Henry thought that this would be a good thing. The timing for that partnership was to be next year, when the opening came. So Henry came home to share all of his experiences and his plans with his father. Came back to Charleston, and they met him down there on the battery when his ship landed and said, "Your father died 4 days ago." Just in time to settle the estate. Henry and his brother were left the estate, not their younger sister, who complained and complained that she had been left out. And so Henry attempted to sort of settle things after it was all over to prevent a serious rift in the family. He worked at it, and he worked at it, and he worked at it, and incidentally, he worked at it for almost 3 years. He got it settled with his sister. There was never any problem with his brother's settlement. And then Henry himself went back to take up the partnership back in England. And when he got to England, he was met at the seashore and was told that because they had not heard from him, they had awarded the partnership to another man. But if indeed Henry would stay as an apprentice for another year or so, when another partnership would probably open, it would be Henry's. Well, now, Henry Lawrence is an ambitious man, and incidentally, as you'll pick up as we go along, a right canny fellow. He figured waiting another couple of years for a partnership that might or might not operate or open for him was not a good idea. And so he began to solicit customers when he was in England for a firm which he called Austin and Lawrence. Now, George Austin was a factor in Charleston, a friend of the Lawrence family. Henry himself and George Austin, who was about 20 years his senior, had worked together. But there wasn't any such thing as Austin and Lawrence yet. Henry made his deal with several people. He lined up customers. He said goodbye and on good terms to James Crockett and came back to Charleston and told George Austin what he had done and asked if it was all right to establish Austin and Lawrence. And George Austin, who was getting along in years, thought that was a good idea. So be it. So was it. Henry Lawrence then became a factor, a tradesman in Charleston. He's not a planter. He's not a professional man, neither a physician nor an attorney, but he's a tradesman of the common herd not the nobility strain. But success came almost immediately. Henry Lawrence got a reputation of rising early and tending to his chores. Henry Lawrence always delivered as he said he was going to deliver. Henry Lawrence was a man who, when you owed him money, reminded you but did not pressure you. Never in all his career did he go to court to collect dues to him. And there are many records of people who owed him money who never paid him. He was a rather generous man. With his Huguenot background, when it came time to go to church, since the Anglican Church was established in South Carolina in those days, he joined St. Philip's. He was a regular member at St. Philip's Church and a generous contributor. And the money rolled in. He served with George Austin. Altogether, they were there for 22 years. For 14 years, it was Austin and Lawrence. And then George Austin, old and infirm, dropped out of the business. And Henry did it by himself for a while, until he later picked up another partner, John Gervais. And so the money kept rolling in. Henry decided it was time for him to branch out from just being a tradesman here in Charleston. And he began to buy plantations. Before it was over, he owned 7 different plantations. His favorite was up the river a few miles from Charleston, called Mepkin. His second most favorite was called Mount Tacitus, a few miles further up the river, the Cooper River. He also had some land in Georgia. And Broughton Island, for instance, was another one of his favorite places. He also had one called New Hope. He had some land up at 96. Suddenly, the man who was a tradesman now becomes a planter, and he gradually gets out of the trade business. But not all the way out. He always did work on a commission basis. You bring your goods in, Henry Lawrence would sell them for you in England for a commission charge. But when he had his own plantations, of course, he would sell his own goods. He bought his own ships. He owned 3 ships. They were ocean-worthy ships. In one of his letters he writes, I am able to load my ship at the dock at Mepkin and float it down the river and out across the ocean. Now, often he went only to the Bahamas, but he also had contacts in England. He also had contacts with the Guinea business, and that is, he bought and sold slaves. The establishment in Charleston, the highest level of society, looked down on the buyer and seller of slaves. It's okay to own slaves, they thought, so long as you were a good slave owner instead of a bad slave owner. But buying and selling, but the money was just as good. And he got 7 plantations for Henry Lawrence. It also got him a wife. One of the outstanding families in Charleston was the Ball family. They had a series of plantations of their own up the Cooper River where it branched off in a place, in a little tea place up there they called the Coming Tea. The beautiful Eleanor was right famous in society in Charleston. Eleanor Ball. And when he was 27 and she was 19, they married. So Henry Lawrence moves now from the merchant class into the planter class, the Ball family. Later, when we talk about Francis Marion in this gathering, we'll find that some of his in-laws remained Tories. And as he showed us in that film that some of us saw last night, when Francis Marion defeated the crowd of Tories there at Black Mingo and captured the horse of the leader of the Tories, that leader of the Tories was Henry Lawrence's brother-in-law. And the horse Francis Marion later took, he named Ball. And so Henry Lawrence and Eleanor, they made a fine couple. She was tall, and all descriptions are with her nickname, the beautiful Eleanor. He himself was rather a swarthy man, dark-complected, short by today's standards, average by those standards. He was about 5'7". He was always slender. He was always in good health. He was rather robust until the rheumatism and the gout got to him. Otherwise, his health was good until his last days. They lived together for 20 years in the Charleston mansion that he built, but also at Mepke. In those 20 years, Eleanor produced 12 children. Only 4 of them survived. Only 4. The oldest, a boy named John, named for Henry Lawrence's father, was a rather precocious fellow, intelligent, energetic, healthy. We'd call him athletic. He loved to ride. He loved to hunt. He loved to dance. He was a beau ideal. He became the apple of his father's eye almost from the start. The second daughter was named Martha. Martha was not a great beauty, but evidently she was an attractive person. Martha later in life became something of a religious zealot. She wrote religious tracts and read them, and she prayed a lot, quite different from her father Henry, who went to church when church opened its doors and gave his money, and then didn't let it bother him too much on the outside. Martha, when they were in Europe at one time, received a proposal of marriage. And her father vigorously opposed the proposal and finally persuaded Martha that he was right, that the suitor was simply a fortune seeker. And so Martha turned him down. She was 27 before she married. She married back in Charleston. She became the third wife of Dr. David Ramsey, who was a very successful physician, but also one of the early historians of the state of South Carolina. He already had children, and they had children of their own. Martha managed the household. It was a matriarchy. And as we'll see in a minute, in his last days, Henry, who had fallen on hard times, came back to live at Mepke, and Martha was there. And Martha not only managed her own household, but took care of her father in a loving manner. The third child was another boy, the third survivor. His name was Henry Jr. Henry Jr. lacked the ambition that his father and his older brother had. He evidently was a capable man. In his later days, because he was Henry Lawrence's son and John Lawrence's brother, he was elected to the state senate, and he was distinguished by the fact that he attended very, very rarely. He took part in no debates, and there is no law that has his name attached to it at all. It's quite surprising that that happened, because when he married the daughter of John Rutledge, who had been the president of South Carolina, and who was very well connected politically. But Henry contented himself by taking over the leadership in the role as the manager of the plantation called Mount Tacitus. And he lived his life in some happiness, but not political at all. The fourth child that survived was Eleanor, named for her mother. The mother's 12th child. And incidentally, the mother died as a result of the birth. Eleanor, strong-willed, a noted beauty like her mother, who at age 16 fell in love with the dashing Charles Pinckney, whose father was rather prominent himself, and said to her father, "I will marry Charles Pinckney." And he persuaded her that at age 16, it was a little early, wait for 2 years, 18. And she reluctantly waited until she was 18, and then on her 18th birthday, she married Charles Pinckney. He goes down in the history books as Blackguard, Charlie the Blackguard Pinckney. He was the governor of South Carolina on 3 occasions. He was one of those representatives at the Constitutional Convention, and he is one of those who claims to have almost entirely written the federal Constitution. Some historians complain about that and dispute that. But he was an effective and an important member of the Constitutional Convention. When he built his house, it was down near Charleston. It's what you and I call in the area of Mount Pleasant, we call it Sneed Farms. And those of you who saw Gone with the Wind and noted Ashley Wilkes' home, that made it into the cinematographic history of the United States, because it was the home that was shown in that movie to be the Wilkes homestead. I believe you call that 7 Oaks or 10 Oaks or 12 Oaks. 12 Oaks. When the first daughter, Martha, was less than 1 year old, she was pronounced dead. And they had a wake there in Henry Lawrence's home for this daughter. And during the wake, one of the guests noticed that the little curtain above the open casket was moving. And so they went to investigate, and they found that the girl was not dead. And they revived her. And as we said earlier, she lived a good and full life. It seems as though it was not unknown in the 1740s, 1780s, 1790s, that there were stories about people being buried alive. That haunted Henry Lawrence. And he had an example right there in his own family. As the 1760s merged into the 1770s, and a revolutionary spirit spread throughout South Carolina as well as through the rest of the colonies, Henry Lawrence decided that it was his duty as a citizen to become politically active. He was elected to the local Congress, the provincial Congress. He called it the House of Assembly. So he was an assemblyman in Charleston. He was a conservative, the way we would put it today. He was loyal to the king. When the Stamp Act came out, 1765, he was a member of the Assembly. And he said in the Assembly, I do not like the Stamp Act, but it is the law. We must obey the law. The phrase that he used was a gracious, as he put it, a gracious obedience to the law. That made him suspect immediately. One night, in his mansion there in Charleston, a mob broke into the house to demand the stamps that they were sure that he had, that he was ready to sell. He announced that he didn't have any stamps, and they didn't believe him, and he got his dudgeon up, and he says, you will not accuse me of misrepresentation. I have no stamps. He even went to the extreme of volunteering to fight a duel with anyone who dared to persist in this charge against him. He stood them down. They said to him, well, sign this pledge. We'll just draft a pledge. They did it right on the spot. A few men back in the back of the crowd. The crowd was about 20 people. Back in the crowd, they made up a voucher for him to sign that he was not in favor of the stamp tax, that he didn't have any stamps, that he never would sell any stamps. And he said that he would never sign any document on pressure from a mob. He stood them down. They went home. They went home. As a matter of fact, he never did sell any stamps. And he was one of those who made the suggestion when the tea came later and came into Charleston Harbor, that tea be located in a secret place. They put it, out at Fort Johnson. They hid it at Fort Johnson. They didn't dump it into the harbor like they did in Boston, but they hid it. And later they sold that tea at public auction to support the revolution. Henry Lawrence became later, from the House of Assembly, when he was asked to join the royal court, that is, the cabinet established by the king to carry through the king's orders. He refused. He says the only people who are ever on this court are people who are already with their minds made up to forever be loyal to the king, and they were sycophants for the king. So he refused to join them. And then in later days, in 1772, when the provincial Congress was established, and this is a rival thing. The king has his cabinet, but South Carolina developed a sub-cabinet of South Carolina that was in tension with the king. And he joined it. At first, he was made lieutenant governor of that body. Charles Pinckney, whose son later married Lawrence's daughter. One wonders what Thanksgiving dinner was like with old Phil Marion. But when Charles Pinckney resigned, then Henry became the commander of what you and I would call the executive committee. And it operated in the name of the provincial house. When there was a campaign up in the upcountry against the Indians, Henry Lawrence joined the campaign as a lieutenant colonel. He later wrote back. He was a voluminous, or whatever that word is, writer of letters. Don't get started in the Lawrence letters unless you can set aside 4 or 5 years to read them through. They're just voluminous. But in one of those letters he wrote, in poking fun at himself, who would have thought that Henry Lawrence, who barely knew how to ride a horse, would sit astride sometimes 14 hours out of 18, riding around to recruit men and to carry messages. But he did his duty. He did his duty. He came back to Charleston. In 1772, his children were small. He was not content with the education that they were getting. And it was time, he thought, for him to drop out of politics. And so he took his family, the 4 children and a servant, to England. There he was going to put his first son, John, into school. And of course the others would go too. The main purpose was to take care of this number 1 son. He went over to England and he tried to make friends there. He was discontented with the English society. He thought they were snobs. He thought that they were not at all sympathetic toward the Americans. He didn't like his teachers. He thought they were teaching his children the wrong things. And so he removed them from England to Geneva. He had a little trouble with the schools in Geneva as well. And he moved from Geneva. And he moved to the southern part of France. And they settled in a place not far from the present city of Nîmes in southern France. Bought a place there. Later on, his brother, James, came to live in that place. But Henry stayed until 1773, and then came back to America. Just at that time, the Boston Tea Party had happened up in Boston, and Henry was among those who protested. Once more, he was elected. Within 6 months of his return to Charleston, he was elected once more to a leadership position. And here he protested greatly against the intolerable acts, as we were calling them. The British, of course, called that the Boston Port Bill. And they were punishing Boston for the Boston Tea Party. Henry Lawrence was one of those that organized and spearheaded the transfer of equipment and of supplies and food. We sent food to Massachusetts because Massachusetts was being persecuted, we thought, by this bill. He also advocated sending money to John Wilkes in John Wilkes' famous dispute with the king, another way to take an anti-royal stance. He was a leader of several opportunities. And then when South Carolina formed the association, he became the leader of the association, and he was the chairman of the Committee of Safety. Now the association went throughout the colony, carrying with them a vow, asking people to sign on to say that they would not follow the king, but they would follow South Carolina, that they did believe in local self-government and not government from London. And he pushed that. He's one of the leaders in getting people to sign. Committee of Safety, of course, was an organization that did several things, one of which was to pile up guns and ammunition. just in case, Henry Lawrence had come around, a long way around. He wasn't a conservative anymore. In fact, he was like many in America. They really, to start with, weren't anti-British. But as time went on, they became American. And so he would have described himself as an American, willing to be under the British control, if indeed the British were reasonable about their control. Alas, when he heard of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, he wept, and he dressed in black, and he was saying to people all around, I regret the fact of independence, but I believe in freedom, and I believe in self-government. He was pushed into self-government. In 1777, he was elected to the Continental Congress. And so he left South Carolina in 1777. And so he was not in South Carolina in 1780 when that time came around, of course, and when General Lincoln had to surrender Charleston. And as we heard earlier today, Francis Marion barely escaped being involved in that surrender himself. Neither was Henry Lawrence. He got to Philadelphia to be in the Continental Congress in August of 77. And in October, just 4 months later, when John Hancock decided finally to resign as the president of the Continental Congress, and Francis Lightfoot Lee was in line to succeed him, to the surprise of Henry Lawrence and to others, his name was put forth. And when the vote came on this man who hadn't been there but 4 months, he won the election unanimously to be the president of the Continental Congress. And he served in that capacity for 14 months. The gout was so bad, some days he could not walk. He was frequently carried into the assembly room there in Philadelphia and seated in the president's chair. He once more showed his capacity for hard work. He wrote great numbers of letters. He arrived early and he stayed late. There were some significant things that happened when he was the president of the Continental Congress. The first thing that they had to work on was the Burgoyne captivity. When General Burgoyne surrendered in the classic victory for the affair in the northern colonies at Saratoga, what to do with all the prisoners? There were 3,000 prisoners. General Gates, not knowing what to do, had said to General Burgoyne, well, write it out. And Burgoyne wrote the terms of surrender and what would happen to his men. They were very, very favorable terms to the British. When those terms came to the Continental Congress to be adopted by the Congress, Henry Lawrence was one of those who protested. We never accepted the Burgoyne resolutions, by the way. Those Burgoyne resolutions said that we would feed the soldiers, we would see to it that the soldiers were transported back to England, we would see to it that all the officers kept their guns, very favorable terms. Instead of that, we canceled the terms. And of course the British made all sorts of complaints about that, but we did cancel the terms. Burgoyne himself was made a captive. And, most of the men were located in the back country of Pennsylvania and down into Virginia. Some of them, who could play musical instruments, later played musical instruments with Thomas Jefferson in his house there in Monticello. First thing then that Henry Lawrence did was to oppose the Burgoyne resolution. The second thing is it was during his tenure as president that we signed the French alliance. The terms of signing the French alliance has Henry Lawrence's name at the top of the list. We then became allies with the French, not just friends, but actual allies with the French. And when the Conway cabal, led by a man named Moncure Conway, tried to tell the Continental Congress that George Washington was a loser and we ought to replace him, probably with Gates, it was Henry Lawrence who finally, after some indecision, and there's reason to believe that at first he was ready to go with Gates instead of Washington. But his son John was at the time on Washington's staff, and John would keep him informed as to the conditions and the problems. And Henry Lawrence swung around and became a powerful advocate of retaining George Washington as a commander of the American forces. And the last thing I mentioned, one of those letters, he deplored in the worst possible terms, it seemed, absenteeism among the congressmen. Great numbers of congressmen would come to Philadelphia and sign in and stay a day or so and go home and be gone for months. Sometimes the Continental Congress was unable to raise a quorum, and Henry Lawrence complained, sort of in tune with Tom Paine, that we've got some sunshine soldiers, you know, some summer patriots. It made a lot of them mad. When he came up for his re-election after 1 year in office, he was barely re-elected. And 2 months after that, he was given a different assignment. And that is, in the latter part of 1778, he was asked to be our ambassador to the Netherlands. And his main purpose over there was to sign some sort of treaty of amity and commerce and to come home with $10 million. He's got to float alone $10 million with the Dutch. He accepted that assignment. He came back home. He was at home in 1779. He was at home in 1780. But he was at Mepkin, not in Charleston. And so when Lincoln surrendered those in 1780 in Charleston, he was able to get away. He wasn't able to find a ship out of Charleston. The British were there. He had to go back to Philadelphia. He found him a ship in Philadelphia. And he went across to England. He and one servant. He had his letter box with him. You and I'd call it a briefcase, but it was a box, you know, covered in leather. A letter box. A British ship appeared on the horizon and called to the United States ship. It was called the Mercury, but it was slow. So he called to the Mercury to heave to, and the Mercury decided to run for it. Put up all sails, moved as fast as they could. The British ship came closer and closer. Finally, as it got very close, Henry Lawrence realized they were going to be overtaken. And he had his credentials with him and his letterbox, and so he gave instructions for the letterbox to be destroyed, and it was thrown overboard. But the British saw it being thrown overboard, and they fished it out with long poles. And in it, they found a draft treaty of amity and commerce between the Netherlands and the new United States. Henry Lawrence was made a prisoner. He was carried to London. In London, he was accused of being a traitor to the crown. He was put into the Tower of London as a prisoner by Lord North's government. Lord North's government said that he was a state prisoner. Don't have to be charged. Something like Guantanamo Bay, I think. Don't have to be charged for your state prisoner. He was not a prisoner of war. And Henry Lawrence always claimed he was a prisoner of war. But the British said state prisoner. In some very minor research one day, I tried to find a spot in the Tower of London where Henry Lawrence was incarcerated. And the guide there, after consulting some of his papers, pointed to the very same rooms that Sir Walter Raleigh had occupied about 200 years before. It was 14 months in that prison. It was cold, it was drafty, the food was not good. He was denied contact with the outside world. He was charged rent on the cell. He was charged for food that he ate. He was provided with some servants, and he was charged for the compensation of the servants. One of those servants, it was a man and his wife, the wife occasionally smuggled him in a pencil and a scrap of paper. He was not allowed to receive any mail. And so he was able to contact some of the outside world, very, very slightly, in pencil, on scraps of paper, which this guard smuggled out under her skirts to get it back to the outside. It was very, very, very serious. After 8 months, he wrote a letter to the king's ministers. And he said that he was being held and that he thought he was being held improperly. And if they would look carefully at his past, they would find that he was a king's man until the last. And then he swung over when he thought that conditions just demanded that he swing over. He never got a response from the king's ministers. After the 12th of his 14 months, he wrote another letter, urged by friends who had come to see him. This letter went to the House of Commons itself, saying the same sort of thing. And that is that he had been a king's man, he had been accused of a king's man, he had defended the king's activities until he was just forced by circumstances to go the other way. Edmund Burke was one of those who spoke on the floor of the House of Commons in his behalf. And the House of Commons finally agreed that the man was worthy of dismissal. Lawrence suggested that he be exchanged for General Burgoyne. General Burgoyne is still a prisoner in America. The first suggestion like that was rejected. After all, Burgoyne is a prisoner of war, and technically at least, Henry Lawrence is not a prisoner of war. He's a prisoner of state. He's a state prisoner. When the House of Commons had made its decision that he was worthy of dismissal, he made a second suggestion, and that is that he be exchanged for Lord Cornwallis. Lord Cornwallis was a very highly respected British officer, a rather famous British officer. And in those terms, the exchange was completed. And so Henry Lawrence was dismissed from the Tower of London on December the 31st, 1781. He had been in that jail for 14 months. He was never well again. The first thing that he did was go to the British spa town of Bath. I guess that goes in the low country of South Carolina. Maybe it's Bath, but anyway, it's Bath is where he went. And his health, got a little bit better, but his health was never restored. He went over to France, where his brother was still living down there in Nîmes. Nice, warm part of the French Midi. And their life was a little more pleasant, but he never did get well. He was back and forth. He got back to France to try to get the loan from the Dutch. He went to Amsterdam and he found John Adams there, and he found that John Adams, in the absence of Lawrence, had concluded to loan himself, and that the loan was in effect, but Henry Lawrence didn't do it. He also got to Versailles to help write the preliminary peace treaty. And the preliminary peace treaty is in 1782. He got there the night before the signing. The night before the signing. His heart was heavy. He had learned just that day before that his darling son John had been killed in a rather inconsequential skirmish in the low country of South Carolina. As a matter of fact, one of the lights in his life went out. But he got there just in time to have a very slight input to the Treaty of Versailles, by which the American independence was won. Two things. The first thing that he did was to echo one of John Adams' famous causes, and that is the guarantee that Americans would be allowed to fish along the Grand Banks. Not simply the British and the Canadians, but the Americans too. The second thing that he did was to put into the treaty a clause which said that the British could not take away any slaves or other property from the states. That had been a bad condition. Property had been destroyed, items of furniture had been stolen, and of course, slaves had been taken. He was not present, incidentally, when the formal treaty was signed in 1783. But he had come back home. When he got back home, he found that his plantation was destroyed. The great big house was burned. He had to live in a little outbuilding for a while. Gradually, he and the 10 slaves that he found, I'm not sure how many slaves he had, but most of the slaves had either been taken or had run away. And 10 remained. And so I assumed he had 30, 40, maybe even 50 slaves. but there were 10 left. With the help of those slaves, they built up a house. Martha, it was big enough for the Ramseys to live in, and Martha helped take care of him. He once more began to develop his plantation. He made some crops. He had bought a ship, and it was once more resuming his shipping. He brought his son's bodies back and buried them in a nice little grassy plot right down before the Cooper River. And he prepared for his own death. And he feared that he might be buried alive. Listen to what he wrote in his will. And now, having settled all affairs which relate to my estate, and provided for the different parts of my family in a manner which appears to me to be just and equitable, I come to the disposal of my own person. I solemnly enjoin it upon my son, it'll be Henry Jr., I solemnly enjoin it upon my son as an indispensable duty that as soon as he conveniently can, after my decease, he cause my body to be wrapped in 12 yards of tow cloth and burnt until it entirely is consumed, totally. And then, collecting my bones, deposit them wherever he shall think proper. Henry Jr., with the help of terrified slaves, carried out the wish. Martha, regarding it as macabre and irreligious, remained in the main house. The bones of Henry Lawrence were collected and interred next to those of his son John on the grassy lawn at Mipkin. They're still there. The main house is near, in one direction, the banks of the lazy Cooper River, the house, and the wide lanes and stately oaks, and the river. The scene is peaceful. So mark the remains of Henry Lawrence, who gave so much to the concept of liberty and so much to the struggle for it, so much a victim of that struggle as were those who fell on the battlefield. Thank you. 10 o'clock on the button. Is there a question that we might be able to answer? Uh-oh.
You were using the word Austin, or how is it spelled?
No, his partner was not the famous Austin family. His partner was A-U-S-T-I-N.
A-U?
Austin, like Austin, Texas.
All right.
Yeah.
Not the country.
No, not so.
Would you say a word about the Lawrence family's anti-slavery activities, having made so much of their fortune on the slave trade? There was a lot of turning the other direction later in life for some of them, I think particularly John. Could you...
I'll say two, maybe three things about that. First, Henry's brother James never engaged in the guinea business, never. It was immoral, he said. And as we said, Henry did. But even though he still held slaves, Henry later in his life, in his midlife, not the last, in his midlife, said, among other things, I hate slavery. And I oppose of slavery. He thought that slavery would eventually be gone, but he wasn't going to do anything to get rid of it himself. So there's a little, maybe it's a conscience hurt him, a little morality inside that's telling him that slavery, and particularly slave trading, is bad. Eventually, he himself, after his fortune was made, quit the guinea business too. In the latter part of his trading days, he did not trade slaves, but he had in the early days. And the third thing I would say about that is his son John. Even Henry has suggested that in the effort to overthrow the king, the American colonies, the South Carolina colonies, should organize and create a black regiment. Now, blacks often served, blacks served with Francis Marion too and all that, as volunteers. But a whole black regiment, no, never. There was always fear of putting guns in the hands of the slaves. And so Henry Lawrence suggested it, didn't push it. But his son John when he was in the legislature near the end of his life, he actually entered a bill before the South Carolina legislature to create an armed black regiment. And John himself saw himself as the commander of the regiment. And he thought, with my reputation and such, I'll be able to handle it. The legislature never acted on it. But that's almost an absolute turnaround. And I think what the questioner knew in the first place, too, Tom, you knew that in the first place. There's an absolute turnaround about the slave issue.
Thank you very much. I'll just point out these Williamsburg mugs that we're giving away were customized with Swamp Fox and the Swamp Fox on it by the lady with the baskets back there, Carolyn Warwick.
South Carolina reenactor. Herb was with us last year and did a really good presentation on Marion's oral books, and was certainly, I thought, one of the highlights of the day. So Herb's back with us again today. No pressure, right? And I'm looking forward to his presentation.
Thank you. I am the odd man out. I'm not a historian. I'm a mechanical engineer, mechanical contractor who now takes care of all Georgetown County's facilities. So my claim to fame is I crawled in one of those 1975 and liked it because I wasn't doing enough with my children and my family. Well, those children got raised doing this, and 29 years later, my wife 30 years later, I'm still doing it. To do it and do it correctly, you really need to find out more about the people. You know, it doesn't take rocket science to figure out how cold you can get one of those things or how hot you can get it. I can tell you that I'm wearing 2 layers of wool on that coat up there, and you can imagine how hot it's going to be in South Carolina. And like it 3 weeks ago in Washington, Georgia, when the water was running through my officer's tent and floating my rug, you can know how cold it can be. So that's not rocket science. What really you have to get into is what the people were all about. My thing about Francis Marion is, number one, I don't think he was ever called a swamp fox until Weems wrote his book. Weems' book is really, really bad. If you don't believe it, ask old Reed, who said it was the worst thing ever done and wrote a whole rebuttal to it. But he was, in fact, and just as George and I were talking a minute ago, right before I stepped up here, he's probably the most studied brigadier general in history. He is, in fact, the only person from the American Revolution, and I was told this by a man who teaches at the War College, so I'm going secondhand, but he's the only person from the American Revolution that at one time or another has been required reading in every war college in the world. When it comes to guerrilla warfare, he's the man. Sadly enough, one of the people who believed in him stronger than anybody else probably around was a guy by the name of Ho Chi Minh, who studied everything he could ever find on Marion and learned it very well to our distress. But how did he get there? The whole period of Marion's career, he was, quote, the swamp fox for 8 months. What did he do the rest of the time? Hard to find out because Marion was very underspoken. He didn't talk about himself. There's not a great deal written about him. To my knowledge, there's not actually a portrait of him ever painted. He was apparently a short, skinny, ugly little fellow from everything all the descriptions say. But he was one heck of a leader. Where did that come from? I got a book that I want to see get published that we can't turn loose of right now because there's an argument between the 2 guys that transcribed it. And it makes me realize when watching the thing last night, I had some critical things to say, but then I realized that I talked to that man and Dr. Henry Lumpkin a year before that was made about making it. But this is back in the days when we had to sit and read and dig, and I had to go to the library with this book that was Marion's orderly book. What did the 2nd South Carolina do every day of the war? We had to dig through that thing on a microfilm machine at the library. Today, I got it on a disc. I hit word search and say, when was he promoted? They had a promotion date wrong last night. When was he promoted? And I get the dates he was promoted to every rank he ever held. It's so much easier today to do than it was. And I'm going to read some things from that orderly book because it gives you guys two things. Number one, it lets you know, it gives you the stilted, and I can't spell it for you. The spelling is really cool, but I can't spell the things out for you as I read it, but it lets you know that they had the same bureaucratic kind of governmental stuff that we had today, that George and me and everybody else that's been in the military in this room had to deal with. Same things went on. What was Marion doing today, 200 years, or in 1776? Well, the parole was for Johnson. The countersign was 33. Only time I found a number. For today and tomorrow, Captain Mott's got the advance guard. Lieutenants Dunbar and Mazek have the rear guard. Lieutenant Blake's is the rear sergeant, and one sergeant have that. The commanding officers of companies present to attest to pay bills and deliver them at the usual times. Okay? Got charged for something, give us your pay bill. This is the day of the month. A court-martial to be held at 11 o'clock to try such prisoners as shall be brought before them. Evidence is to attend. Captain McDonald presides, Lieutenant Fuller and Hall, Dunbar, and Marion. This is the famous Gabriel Marion. This is the nephew. Is on the board. William Sally for gaming sentences to 100 lashes, pardon. Abraham Creighton for drunkenness and insolence received 150 lashes. 150 lashes. That was not a fun-growing party group there, I'm telling you. The Light Infantry Company to hold themselves in readiness to march, eventually to be completed to 1 captain, 3 subalterns, 3 sergeants, and 60 rank and file men to be served with 10 rounds of ammunition per man, 2 spare flints. Captain Peter O'Reilly will be commanding. This detachment will receive his orders from the commanding officer. And on and on and on. Sounds familiar to some of you, I'm sure. The day-to-day business of running a military operation, or running a business for that matter. So Marion was up to his ears in doing this kind of thing. He got there from the general orders by Colonel William Moultrie of June the 21st. This was mentioned, I think, last night. Captains Bernard Elliott, that's a real spelling, Francis Marion, Daniel O'Ree, Francis U.G., William Mason, John McDonald, Peter O'Ree, Everly, Isaac Harrelson, Charles Mott are to be captains of the 2nd South Carolina Regiment. There were, in fact, at that point, the only 2 formed. Now, the warrant called for a total of 6. There were never 6 brought up. Those 2 were formed at that time. There was later an artillery regiment, and the 4th was the 4th, and the 4th was also under William Thompson as a ranger regiment. So there's all kind of weird things. The 2nd and the 1st keep getting filled up as these others go away. But they were brought in to form the 2nd South Carolina, and this is in 1775. They saw the problem coming, they being in the Committee of Safety, the whole thing was coming to a boil. So they brought these folks in and said, okay, we're going to form a regiment. And it was not to be a group of militia. All the stuff on that tent has been researched for the last 29 years, I'm sure, as to coming down to exactly coming as close as we can make it look. Now, we in the 2nd South Carolina are fortunate. Not only do we have the book, the orderly book as to what happened, but there are 22, we thought, now we know 23, because Ann and I saw a guy pull one out of his pocket that belonged to his family, portraits of individuals wearing that uniform. And we know how big the buttons were, so we can take it from the buttons and scale it to what everything else was size-wise. All the other stuff, British. They copied a British regiment. Why not? The most powerful, best equipped superpower in the world. Do what they're doing. So they copied the British stuff. Light infantry cartridge box, bayonet, the whole 9 yards. Where did it come from? Where did these people come from? In 1774, on the rolls of the militia, there were 14,000 people listed on the militia rolls. Some of them were the men's drinking clubs, as someone mentioned. Others were pretty tough, well-trained troops. Wherever Marion went, it tended to be pretty tough, well-maintained troops. Back in 1759, there was a call out of the militia to go fight the Cherokees. Now, this battle, this is a punitive mission. There are no great battles written up. There weren't any battles. Cherokees came to Charleston and said, okay, we quit. And they sent a column of 1,500 men to Cherokee country to, in effect, make a big show of force. And Marion was part of that. Lieutenant Francis Marion was part of that militia force that went up there. And the South Carolina good old boy system being what it was, he's working for a guy by the name of Captain William Moultrie. So these guys go all the way back to 1759, the first time I can find that they actually were working together in a military situation. Now the militia itself was formed differently in South Carolina. I want to digress here a little because this is one of the neatest facts that I've dug out in 30 years. It was formed differently than probably most of the folks in this room realize. There was a militia law on the books as far as 1719, as far back. The first militia law I can find in South Carolina is in 1719. That one's pretty typical, all sick men 16 to 60. That was not the one that really interested me. The one in 1747 is the one that really jumps off the page at you because it flies in the face of everything we've ever learned about the South and South Carolina during that period. All men 16 to 60 and all trusted slaves, all trusted Negro slaves. Now, whoa, that goes against what we've all learned. It goes so far as to say trusted Negro slaves could be enlisted in companies outside of the city of Charleston not to exceed 1/3 of the members of the white men in the company. And the militia companies in Charleston, the total number of enlisted blacks was not to exceed 1/2 of the total male slaves in the town. And it goes on to say, none of this had to do with the black and white issue or the slave issue. It had to do with the economics. We can't afford to have more than that many of them all doing military service. And I'm thinking, this can't be right. My wife Ann read this to me, like woke me up one night at like 11 o'clock and read this, and I said, yeah, all one trusted slave. Okay, I got you. We have one trusted slave in the military. She said, no. How about the fact that in 1750 we had 1,800 plus a few in Georgetown County, which is where I now live, which encompassed all of this, I think at the time. I'm not sure where the county lines were then, but it was huge. It wasn't Georgetown County as it is today. There were 1,800 plus white militiamen. There were 2,250 black militiamen. Now that really goes against everything that we've been told and everything that we've been brought up to believe. That's not quite 20 years from the big rebellion that happened on Sunday when it made all of us wear our swords to church from then on. The only slave rebellion to take place in South Carolina. It goes on to say that in times of alarm they shall be armed by either their masters with a good musket, a hatch powder horn, which I don't know what it is, and a shot pouch with ammunition enough for 20 rounds, 6 spare flints. Any slave or white indentured servant who kills or captures one enemy or captured any enemy in any colors was to be granted his freedom immediately. Any slave who conducted himself bravely in battle but to a lesser degree was to be given each and every year thereafter a livery of coat or breeches of good red Negro cloth turned up, and you can talk to my wife about what that is. She has studied that, trying to figure it out for years. Turned up with blue and a black hat and a pair of shoes. They were serving alongside the whites in numbers that equaled almost 50%. And this is way before the Revolution. Where goes the slave rebellion thing? Now, not only, if you jump ahead to 1779, on September the 11th, when we're on the approach march to Savannah. From a glory standpoint, one of our better days. From a successful standpoint, not one of our better days. But in September the 11th, Marion puts it out in the order book. All servants and slaves shall be issued arms and accoutrements. Don't have to say anything about training them. They're already trained. Just give it to them. Issue them out. We're going to put everybody in the line that we can put in the line going into battle at Savannah, because this is going to be really bad. And we need everybody we can get our hands on. So, here we go with everything just all out of whack. this adds to the whole thing about what Marion did when he becomes the, quote, Swamp Fox. Now, one of my favorite things about this book and about Francis Marion as a leader of our patriot forefathers, and everybody knows about our patriot forefathers, the John Adamses and the Washingtons and the straight-laced people in the portraits that stood up there, and that we all know that founded this country with only the best of the country at heart, and they're not really people, they're our forefathers. Yep. I go to the orderly book and I read some more. And I found fairly early on in book 1, the first place in beautiful downtown Charleston, South Carolina, to become off limits to the military. Well, I think that's what it says. It says, as the Blue Horse Tavern, opposite the barracks yard, is a great nuisance to the good order and discipline of the soldiers, ordered that any non-commissioned officers or soldiers do presume to go into that house without leave of the captain of the day, the officer of the barracks guard, that such non-commissioned officers and soldiers shall be immediately fined, confined, and made depend on being punished. Sounds like off limits to me. Sounds like off limits to me. So they were not quite as straight-laced as we think they are. Maybe our forefathers might have been patriots, yes, a little more laid back than we think they were. But that just gets the place put off limits. By the time Marion's become a major, and Colonel Mott is now commanding the whole regiment, Colonel Mott puts out, this is after the Battle of Sullivan's Island, so Moultrie's been bumped up and Mott's taken over, and Marion's now second in command. Mott writes, and we'll read this one's a little longer, but it's really better as far as I'm concerned. The colonel had had complaints that the men of the regiment frequently fire their arms off through the windows of the barracks. This is in downtown Charleston now. This is south of Broad, folks. The boys that get to having a little fun or whatever and shoot their weapons out the window. All right? It is therefore his orders that no firing of muskets be allowed in or near the barracks. And he particularly desires that the captains of the day will apprehend anyone who may disobey this order and report him who may depend on being severely punished. So they like to shoot your guns. What's that to South Carolinians, okay? All right? But now the fun gets better. This is in the same thing. The boys had really been rowdy when he got to writing this. He has also complaints that many of the men appear on the green near the barracks in a very indecent manner, such as running with one man after another, entirely naked, and playing lascivious tricks and scandals to the regiment. That's streaking, folks. Downtown Charleston, South Carolina, south of Broad, shooting our guns out the window and streaking. Now, I'll submit to you that these young company commanders have the same problem that the young company commanders have got in my time or in the time today. They got bored privates saying, "Hold my beer, watch this. Watch what I can do." And it goes on to say, the orders that nothing of the kind shall happen again on pain of displeasure and assurance of being punished. I already said they beat you 150 times at the drop of a hat. But that's okay. Hold my beer. Watch this. I can get away with it this time. The young officers themselves could have been a bit of a problem, the young lieutenants. Ordered that all horses that are in the barracks are to be sent away. This is to the young officers. For future, none of them are to be admitted after this day into the yard or building. And the parson really went beyond these 20 minutes sometime or another. They had their own little anachronism. They had their own little ways of saying things. Like we say restroom, they said occasion or necessary. Then there is the problem with the troops during their occasion on the parson's front lawn. You went over your 20 minutes, George. You went way over your 20 minutes. These are our ancestors, the ones in the portraits. And more than once the problem with performing the necessary under the gun platforms in the fort. Now this one comes up so much you just quit, you know, you do a word search on that and it just stretches it out, you know. As an aside, I have two sons, one who's now out of the military, who was very much involved in the Black Hawk Down thing as a young officer in Somalia. The other one just got back from Afghanistan in September and left for Iraq in January. So he's been out of country. He's the first sergeant in the 82nd Airborne. While he was in Afghanistan, he was kind of running a fire base. And this fire base is an old Russian fort out in the middle of the desert. And as he said in an email to me, Dad, you got to send me an electronic copy of the orderly book. I just published for the third time today, in no uncertain military mail terms, what to quit doing against the wall under the machine gun position. These are our ancestors, these are our kids. They're the same people. But these are the people that had enough nerve to stand up to the British Army and do what they did. Now, one of the great days in the history of South Carolina, which is still called Carolina Days, and nobody probably even remembers that very much unless you live in Charleston and then they do a few little things. On the 28th of June in 76, the parole was America, the countersign was 25. For the day, Captain Symp was on guard. Boy, how'd you like to have this job? You're the officer to guard for Fort Sullivan on that day. James McDonald and Lieutenant Hollinger. This day at 10 o'clock in the morning, the following ships attacked the fort at Sullivan's Island. Bristol of 50 guns by Commodore Peter Parker. Experiment with 50 guns. Sobey action air frigates 28 guns. The terrible bomb catch. It goes on for 4 more lines. And that's all they say about the battle. That's it. Nothing else. It happened. They trained for it. The Brits came. They kicked them out of Charleston, and that's what happened. And this whole thing literally fills up a quarter of a page, and I'm using big type because my eyes aren't that good anymore. By Colonel Moultrie, countersign, same thing. A return for the dead and wounded in engagement yesterday, this is the next day, will be made the commanding officer, and if they leave wives and children, and if so, where they are. A return of the troops under the command of Colonel William Moultrie, which fought the battle fleet in Fort Algiers, with a list of all killed and wounded. And that's all they say. That's it. In a separate entry, His Excellency John Rutledge, President, and Major General Charles Lee desire that most particularly hearty thanks to the brave officers and men for their heroic duty and the gallant behavior in the engagement against the British fleet on the 28th of June at Sullivan's Island. General Lee says no man ever did, and 'tis impossible that any can ever behave better than will do justice in his letters to the Continental Congress. His Excellency the President has sent a hogshead of rum. Now you're talking to the men. And orders that the quartermaster do serve a gill of rum for a man a day while it lasts. I got rum there. In that knapsack, there's rum and there's a little half gill. I'll get out later and let you see how much that actually was. Orders that the sergeants of the company do reap the thanks of the President General Lee. That's an interesting thing to me. That's an interesting thing that just kind of jumps out when you read it for the 4th or 5th time. The sergeants will read it. That says you got a pretty well decent educated group of people. You're not looking at, so many times we think of just the officers being able to read, but the sergeants were instructed to read. Now, okay, we got the most heroic day of all in the history of the Second South to this point, in most cases. But there was a court-martial, as there was. You can't go through that orderly book a week and not find at least 3 court-martials. Not a week. For a period of 7-8 years, every week there's at least 2 or 3 court-martials. The boys had fun. Most of the ladies in Charleston had the crescents off the hats, or at least some of the ladies did, because they were going somewhere, and somebody was getting flogged for getting rid of their clothes. And it's just like the young man who wrote this book, Patrick O'Kelly, said, man, a special forces flash would just get you all kind of things in third world countries. Anyway, here's what happened at this court-martial right after the battle at Sullivan's Island. The court sentenced Ian Flynn, Edward George, Jacob Copeland, E. Boston, Adam Meek for absence on the day of the battle. They were sentenced to be dressed in women's petticoats and caps, to receive 200 lashes, each which they did receive, John Thompson and Jason Glover were pardoned. Boy, they had a good excuse or something. They made somebody buy something. Dressed them in women's petticoats, put ladies' hats on them, and gave them 200 lashes. I submit to you that was not as politically correct time as it is today. They knew how to get to those boys' spirits and let them know that they disapproved strongly. And really, this whole great day comes and goes, and that's all they said about it. They said more about it when they had the celebration the next year in remembrance of it. And then they just told how many guns they fired up and down the harbor and that kind of thing. Where was Marion that day? I don't know. He was not second in command. He was, in fact, the first company commander, the first captain of the regiment, commander of the light infantry company, somewhere in that fort at Sullivan's Island for the whole day, which makes him a hero in my book. You take on the British Navy and beat them the only time that it could have happened. All right, that brings up the point. We beat the British Navy. That's like the Marion football team beating the Philadelphia Eagles, for goodness sake. I mean, it's hard to conceive. I mean, those people didn't get beat, and they didn't get beat very often throughout their history. Look at the Napoleonic period. The British Navy didn't get beat, but we beat them, and sent Sir Peter Parker home with the seat of his breeches shot out, which is a true statement. How did they get there? They got there just like any army in the world gets there. Orders for the 13th of May. This is before June the 28th. And it says, who the guards are not at. No officer to be absent from the exercise of the cannons in the morning. An officer to take the command of a gun and see that the men do their exercises properly and not to quit their post till the drum beats to arms. The next, on the 16th. For the future, the cannons are to be exercised every Tuesday and Friday. The rest of the week, they are to exercise with small arms by the commanding officer of each company at the beating of the long roll. All officers are to attend, and each to be careful that none of the men absent and send their servants in their places. The officers of each company are desired to be attentive that their men keep their arms clean and in good order. The captain of the day to visit the advance guard once a day and report everything extraordinary to the commanding officer. How did they do it? They drilled, and they drilled, and they drilled, and they drilled, and they did it for months. Two things. Number one, it keeps old Joe Snuffy from getting into the, hey, watch what I can do mode. You know, that's one of the biggest problems you got in Afghanistan today is keeping those kids that are like trained German shepherds and all keyed up from going off and doing something stupid like saying, I can walk through that minefield. The same thing. You got to keep them busy, infantry officer. If you don't keep them busy painting rocks blue or something, then you know they get bored. So you drill them. And in our day, drill meant something. When you took 17 count to load that musket, and it's many to load a cannon, and you're getting graded real hard on how fast you can do it, drill counted for something. So they drilled, and I can't imagine how good they got. I'm supposed to spit when I say this word. Trained all the extras for the Patriot. The movie itself was terrible. I had the best British Army that had existed in this country since Cornwallis left. I was the commander of the British Army at the Camden phase of that movie. I'm a little fat guy by the flag. You see his back going by. We took 2 weeks, 8 hours a day. I said we. I had like 6, 8 guys working with me. My son was certainly the one that's the first sergeant now, was a drill sergeant at Fort Jackson. I mean, what more could I ask for? And I had been a basic training company commander, so we knew how to set up a training schedule. We trained them 8 hours a day, 50 minutes every hour with a 10-minute break. We did this for 2 weeks. And we came out with people that could do all the drill just listening to drum commands. Not even verbal, doing it like they really did it. We got bored and were coming up with things that nobody had probably tried with. We'd find this obscure stuff in the old drill manuals to see if we could do it. In 2 weeks, we did that, just training, and that's 8 hours a day. They did this for months. They didn't have anything else to do. You stuck on Sullivan's Island? That's not the party place of the world. You know, the poor Brits got stuck. You mentioned something about somebody mentioned something about the medical problem. The Brits got stuck on the other side of the bridge, which was at high tide, too deep to get across, particularly when Colonel Thompson's rifles were sitting there waiting for you to come across. which really saved Sullivan's Island and it's full Sullivan, or Moultrie now. But anyway, those guys got stuck up there, and there was a tremendous incidence of insanity from the bugs. That's the kind of thing we don't think about. They didn't have off. They're sitting up there on a sandbar, you know, basically right on the beach, sitting back in the sand dunes with the bugs. It's incredible the kind of stuff that they had to put up with. But the training that we gave these guys to keep them busy, if nothing else, made them into the Army they were. And when everything else fails and you hear that first bullet go crack instead of bang, it comes by your ear, that's what you drop back on. This crazy son of mine that jumps out of airplanes, you know. He jumped out of one over Panama one night at 400 feet, going way too fast, George, because they didn't slow down. And he said, you know, you ask him how many parachute jumps he's made in the Army? He said, one. Now, I got 200 practices, but that one's the only one that counted. And he said, you know, I did everything by the book. When I finally got around to looking at the ground, there it was. It's just like, because you fall back into that thing that you trained. It makes no difference if you're an infantryman or a fighter pilot or you're loading a cannon or what you're doing. If you do it enough times, you're going to do it no matter how scared you are. It's not a matter of bravery, it's how well can you function when you're scared to death. Some folks in this room know what I'm talking about. So, that's how, you know, that's how they did it. And it goes on and on. The 1st and 2nd South Carolina Regiments of Foot are ordered to turn out their men every morning at 5 o'clock. Why does the Army get up so early? To be drilled till 7. So they drill 2 hours, then they eat breakfast. And then they go back and do whatever they got to do all day long. And then from 5 until 7 that evening, they drill again. The sergeant major to take the sergeants out that are on duty or sick and drill them at least once a day. Ordered that the sergeants and corporals of the 1st and 2nd Regiment be drilled together once a day on the parade ground. It just over and over and over. Of course, they probably would have a little problem with it or it wouldn't show up in the book that many times. I mean, somebody's having to tell them to do it over and over and over. And the other thing is, just like any other Army, officers are to see that their men's arms are very clean and that their accoutrements, cartridge box, bayonets, which are nasty, filthy up there. My soldiers ain't real good. Actually stay stored on the truck in my backyard, so that's how to get that way. It was no accident they breached the British Navy. It wasn't the fluke. It was the Palmetto Laws. That helped a whole bunch. When they can't shoot with what you're hiding behind, that's a big plus, no matter what war you're in. But the fact that they could keep firing and that they could get them slowed down and that they could get them to fire in the pace that they were firing at and maintain their ammunition all day long, which was a problem from the very first shot, they could keep that going, had everything in the world to do with the fact that those were trained soldiers. You're going to run me out of time, George. That and the fact that I've already said that they beat on them all the time. These are just cool court-martials. These are ones that caught my eye, you know, where they stabbed each other or they sold, or somebody sold somebody's clothes to buy liquor with. I love the one where the guard got like 250 lashes for taking the prisoners to the Blue Hen Tavern. They're people. They're people. But that's what Marion had to deal with. He dealt with the same things that we deal with today, but look how good he was at it. Look how he adapted. And my point about the blacks was it's not a lily-white American Revolution, not down here. I believe that when they talk about Marion riding into Charlotte to offer his assistance to Gates, but one of the things that Gates mentions is the little leather hats and the fact that about 50% of them were black. And I believe that from the bottom of my heart. I think his core group was more black than white. And that's something we really need to be getting out to these kids around here so they got something to talk about and brag about rather than stuff that folks are trying to make up for them to brag about. This is something important. Their people helped found this country. And some officers got in trouble too. That happens. Now, my printer went wacko and printed in light gray. This is the kind of, this says a bunch about Francis Marion to me. I want to read a paragraph here that he put out to his people. Boy, this, when you were a junior officer and this got read to you, this hurt, this stung. Major Marion is sorry that he is obliged to take notice of the great neglect of the officers not attending their duties more punctually. Roll call in the morning and exercise drill in the afternoon is almost entirely neglected to the very great prejudice of the service. He begs to have to leave to remind them that their country has reposed great trust in them, which is expected. Their honors will not permit them to neglect. Major Marion hopes they will consider their neglect of duty at any point is attended with great evils, not only to the state, but is sure in the end to bring dishonor upon themselves. The Major would rejoice to see the gentlemen do their duty with a willingness and a punctuality, and hope their good sense on serious reflection will prevent the disagreeable necessity of reminding them of their duties in the future. That hurt. You gentlemen that have been in that position realizes he just cut them to the bone. And back in the 18th century, when you talk about a man's honor and what was honorable and what was dishonorable, it's hard for most people today to even understand how that would have hurt. Then he finishes up by saying, divine services will be at 4 o'clock this afternoon. The sergeant and 6 men to go to the general hospital this afternoon to bury the dead soldier of the 1st and 2nd Regiment, and 1 cartridge per man. The Corps is usual, and nobody is to miss divine services. No, he was a religious man, or at least he thought it was a good thing to be a religious man. But the whole thing that he gets those officers with strikes me as strongly as anything I've ever read that Marion said or did about how he felt about duty, honor, country, about how he felt about the stuff that we were taught in the special little schools. I went to the state maximum security college on the Ashley River down there, and they were teaching that back when I was there at Citadel, and they were teaching it at West Point, and they teach it everywhere in the military. And that says it as strongly as anybody ever said it to me. He was given independent command very early on, and I've got note after note after note after where he went up to Fort Dorchester, but George won't let me put that out. His career at this point of his career really kind of winds up. He was made, by the way, when he made Lieutenant Colonel, finally, I skipped a page, in October. After the one thing that really happened was in October the 9th, happened to the 2nd South Carolina in a place called Savannah, Georgia. They went down there to try to take it back from the British, and they worked with the French. And God bless the French. They really, how in the world they came close to conquering the world, I'm not sure, because they sure can mess up things. And they tried to pull something off that morning down there that with all the modern communication and the little boom mics and stuff where everybody can talk to each other and people can look down from the sky and see where you are, it probably wouldn't have worked then, as complicated as that attack was, to try to bring it all together. And I'm afraid that the 2nd Brigade down there that day was the people that didn't get the word, and that included the 2nd South Carolina, and that's called the bloodiest 1 hour of the American Revolution. French lost really, really big, humongous numbers. The Americans, the 2nd South, lost about 80% of its people. We lost our colors. We lost the colors that this is a replica of. And when I say replica, I'm the only person in reenacting that can say that that is a replica of the 2nd South flag that was lost that day. Because our actions that day at Spring Hill Redoubt, British took our colors. They found them under Lieutenant Bush's body after Sergeant Jasper had been killed and Lieutenant Gray and everybody in the color guard. Somebody got off with the red colors. We're not sure what they look like because they were captured honorably. They were captured in Charleston when Charleston fell. British don't display colors that weren't captured honorably. That's the only flag the British ever displayed after the American Revolution. We're the only regiment that lost our colors honorably in an attack. Go to the museum, State Museum. They're still there. We're not swapping them back and forth. They bought them back from Maitland's family. They don't belong. The Smithsonian's not taking them every other year like they were going to because they're busy working on restoration of Old Glory now. The original of that's there. The holes in it are where the bacteria ate the blood from Lieutenant Blush and Jasper and those people. Unbelievable slaughter. They ran head on. We think now they didn't go up the hill on the redoubt. They went between two redoubts and got caught by crossfire from cannon shooting grape shot, which is just giant shotguns. It's unbelievable slaughter. So, who was Francis Marion? Honorable? Yes. As honorable as you could get in those days. Not a prideful man. He certainly wasn't a Gates. Not even a portrait painted of him. Not much said about him, even in his own regiment. He just quietly did his job. He was a man of God. Can't say he didn't push it off on people because he did. He made them go to church because he thought that was the thing to do. Good French Huguenot that belonged to the Episcopal Church down in Santee, South Carolina. Working with blacks, black and white didn't make any difference to Marion. It was what kind of soldier you were that made the difference to Francis Marion. And that's something you need to go away from here with. That the blacks were very much a part of the whole Swamp Fox legend. And understanding how men work. I can tell you funny stories about Peter O'Reilly capturing the rum ration for the British and the boys getting a little drunk and deciding 6 of them were going to take back Georgetown and almost got away with it. Some really funny things happen. And yet, Marion doesn't get totally upset. He just keeps telling them, you're working with militia, you're working with people that don't have to be here. Francis Marion had more common sense and more charisma than anybody short of George Washington, probably. And I respect his charisma about more than anybody's around. But Marion was just one fine leader. 2 asides, George. I'll quit, George. I promise. I really do. 2 asides. Number 1, did Francis Marion really break his ankle? I don't know. But I guarantee you the whole 2nd South Carolina staff didn't break their ankles. And they all got out of Charleston. Pure conjecture, somebody told them to leave. Somebody told them to get out if they were the last of them. And probably the governor. Because at Utah Springs, I think there's something out there, Christine, I got a book that was done by Billy Brunson years ago, that can come back and say that 80 or 92% or something like that of the militia, the South Carolina militia at Utah Springs, belonged to either the 1st, 2nd, or 4th South Carolina at one time or another. I'll see if I can find that for you. Last thing, you see that flag? No. Any South Carolina flag in the world came from some Carolina moon song sung somewhere, and that ain't right. That's not the way it looked. The South Carolina flag wasn't even standardized until the early 19th century. It ain't a moon, it's a crescent. It's a crescent in the palmetto tree, and the crescent stands straight up and down and says Liberty on it. And that's what's on the flag. It's not any moon. That's it. And everything is supposed to stand straight up and down. It's not cocked. That came from the whole idea that it was a moon or something. It's really supposed to look that way, because we're the ones that invented it in 1750. It was on our hats that far back. We just stamped Liberty on it for the American Revolution. I quit now, George. Okay. You folks that are really interested, this kid is like another son to me. He's written this book, dry reading? Mm-hmm. But if you're really interested in what the battles that took place in South Carolina, he's got, in North and South Carolina, he's got the order of battle down to company command level of who commanded what on both sides and the number of casualties, and really a well done thing. We have him for sale here. Now, I don't know him anymore. Thank you.
One thing that, don't go away. We had teachers from the local area in here, and that's why the tent is set up. If you want to take a look at this, it's accurate like Herb said, but that's not a 2-person tent. That's five or six people in there. So walk by and look at it. You're going to get to know your buddy pretty close when you do that. The bus is waiting outside.
met her and her husband, Bob, when they moved to Santee, and just delightful people, and glad to have them with us this weekend. Dr. Sloan, if you would come.
George, am I plugged in?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. First, I am not a historian. I am a